books. So have you read either of these books, Miss Garcia? Either Heart of Darkness, have you heard of these books? Have you read either of these books, Heart of Darkness or Things Fall Apart?
No. Are any of them Latino books?
No, they're not.
That's probably why I have not heard of them.
No, so they both focus roughly about, I guess, without sounding like they talk really about the same things, because in some ways they have a contentious relationship. But they both focus on European imperialism of Africa. The first book was written in around 1899, right at the height of new imperialism, and right after the Conference of Berlin, where European powers divide up Africa. The author of this book is Joseph Conrad. It's a really cool book where Joseph Conrad most likely went up the Congo River. He arrived, or he was probably he was on a steamboat as well. He was part of. He was a colonizer as well. He was an imperializer. Oh my God, my language already is not great. But the premise of the book is it's a fiction book. It stars Marlowe, but it's kind of loosely based on Joseph Conrad's experiences in Africa. Obviously, it was written in 1899. There was a lot of people that read Conrad's book, and they saw it as a critique of imperialism. I can show you some short quotes from Joseph Conrad. Let me find my...
as you're describing the book, I have a movie suggestion. Okay, I'm not on Bluejeans. Have you ever seen Mountains of the Moon?
I have not seen Mountains of the Moon. What is Mountains of the Moon about?
So I'm gonna send you the link, but let me read the summary of it. I had to watch it for my culture and communication class. Mm-hmm. It says okay. I'm not tech savvy today. Where is it? It could be a good movie to recommend to the kids if you think this aligns with the book. It's a 1990 biographical film depicting the 1857 to 1858 journey of Richard Francis Burton and John Hanning Speke in their expedition to Central Africa, which culminated in Speke's discovery of the source of the Nile River and led to a bitter rivalry between the two men.
That would be cool. Mountain of the Moon. I'll definitely look at that. So let me get into the reason why I wanted to talk about two books today. Heart of Darkness is often viewed appropriately as a critique of imperialism, a critique of European colonialism, but it is said by the author of Things Fall Apart and by a lot of literary scholars that Heart of Darkness is racist. That despite the fact it is a critique of colonialism and European imperialism, it is a very racist book. The protagonist has racist ideas, and even if, and then it brings questions about literature. Do we evaluate literature based on what it's like to live in those times? It seems, to me at least, that it's a progressive or more progressive idea to critique colonialism and imperialism, and I'll show you how the book does that and structure that. But also, there are some obvious limitations to the book. Do these great literary authors like Joseph Conrad, do they get a pass because of the norms of their times, and then being somewhat deviant from the norms of their time already? And do they get a pass, or do the fact that they do some and kind of embody, or the perspectives that at least that dominate the book, do the fact that those perspectives come across as racist perspectives, does that mean that we should strike them from the Western literary canon? Those are some big questions. What do you think? As I'm finding a quote.
What was your question again?
That was a long-ended response, but I guess the first question I'm asking is that, like, do works of literature, should we evaluate works of literature, like if the perspectives that are in works of literature, let's just say for the sake of this, that Marlowe in Heart of Darkness embodies exactly what Joseph Conrad thinks, right? And there's limitations to that as well, because what if Joseph Conrad doesn't really embody that? Well, Marlowe often sees Africans in Heart of Darkness as kind of like periphery characters. He doesn't engage them very much. They're kind of just either victims or not really agents in the story. So should we, I guess, strike this book from reading at some of the greatest colleges in the United States, because it is one of the major works of Western literature? So should we stop reading it?
I don't think we should stop reading it. For the same reasons that I would never say like stop reading like those great philosophers like Hegel or Kant. I mean, I think we need to. I don't think they should be banned from being read in like great colleges. I think we just need to read them more critically.
Yeah, and I think that's a interesting perspective. So let me find a quote. I had all these highlighted. This is actually from a really cool article where this was written in the 90s, so it comes with its own unique 90s vibe, but it's from the New Yorker, and there's this writer for the New Yorker goes to Columbia University and sits in at this like college freshman course called, I think it's Lit Hume. I don't know what the course is called, but basically the course focuses on major works of Western literature. Like you said, the great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, you said Hegel and Kant, but it focuses on like those philosophers, and then it goes through time. And the last book that the kids actually read is Heart of Darkness. So he goes back and he basically evaluates the dynamics of the course, and he wrote a book about it, which I actually ordered recently. But this is like one chapter from Heart of Darkness that kind of lays bare like the critique of colonialism. So this is embedded in the whole New Yorker article, but I think the New Yorker article does a good job of like focusing these excerpts. So he puts in here, they were dying slowly, meaning the Africans that Marlowe sees in the Congo. They were not enemies, they were not criminals, they were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom, brought from all the recesses of the coast in the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food. They sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleam of the eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand. The black bones reclined at full length with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind, white flicker in the depths of the orbs, which died out slowly. So it kind of really lays bare how overworked Africans were in the Congo. It does that with all kinds of fantastic imagery. And this is one of those passages that is kind of like supposed to show how critical it was of European colonialism and the abuses of it. Well, Chinua Achebe, who's an African writer that writes in the 1950s about European imperialism. So he writes a fiction book about European imperialism and how it affects, an African village. He says that even when Conrad is most explicit about his critiques of imperialism, or he would say, he doesn't say this, I'm not quoting him, but he kind of refers to Africans as, black shadows of disease and starvation. He refers them as to kind of like objects that are being acted upon. Even if he's being critical of European imperialism, they're never really giving their own independent voice in this novel. Despite the fact that they are shown as being abused by European colonialists, there's a famous scene at the end of the novel without giving it away, because this is just to encourage students to read these books, where Africans are viewed as kind of primitive and as following the lead of Europeans. So Achebe is very critical of this book. I think it's very, very cool. I think that both of the books are very impactful for me. They both made me very interested in politics. This one I read in my senior year of high school, and then this one I read in college. Where was I going to go with this? Oh, this is a really cool article. Just a side point. It talks about basically this small class at an elite university, Columbia University, kind of discussing the great books and trying to find value in reading great and classical books, because and it brings interesting questions to the forefront. Is literature just about enjoyment, or does it speak to us both at like the sociological level and the historical level? I think it does both. I think it is for enjoyment, but then it speaks to that. It also has oftentimes political messages. I think that's the best literature, and kind of the literature that is most revered kind of comes with interesting political messages. And so I think that raises all sorts of questions whether literature should also be criticized for those political messages that it presents. And I think that's what Achebe would say, that literature, if it presents political messages like Heart of Darkness does, it should be criticized. He's very critical of it. And let me just show you some works. And then I'll ask you if you want to read them. Where is Achebe? So this is also from the New Yorker article. So the author of the New Yorker article is critical of Achebe for criticizing Conrad, and that becomes evident. So he kind of presents Achebe's criticism. As far as Achebe is concerned, Africans have struggled to free themselves from the prison of colonial discourse, and for him, reading Conrad meant re-entering the prison. Heart of Darkness is a book in which Europeans consistently have the upper hand. Okay, and then this is him being critical of it. Edward Said, who wrote Orientalism, we talked about that in class. He's also critical of Heart of Darkness. Where's his excerpt?
I think I've read Said. Does it talk about...
I think you probably did if you were a communications major.
I think I read it in grad school for critical race theory.
Yes, and you probably did. So he talks about Orientalism and how, oh my God, I'm blanking. But how Europeans basically had this concerted artistic effort to depict peoples in the Middle East as like once being, yeah, exactly, exotic. There's that famous image on his book of like the naked boy with the serpent. So almost like sexually perverted, exotic, and therefore needing to be civilized. So Said is also critical of Conrad. So these are all great authors that are critical of Conrad's depiction in Heart of Darkness, which is interesting.
And it reminds me, again, I'm not very familiar with like African literature, Asian literature, but I don't know, I think I've mentioned it to you before. It reminds me of a short account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas, where he is talking about like the horrible mistreatment of the indigenous people in the Americas, but even in him writing like with like so much like out of emotion and more than like logic, like it's still very like condescending towards like the indigenous people.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I wasn't even going to bring that up, but they actually had that as their last document on their last DBQ. They had an excerpt from the destruction of the Indies, and you're exactly right. He does come across kind of condescending, right? I think there's oftentimes in like European interaction with peoples in like the Americas, whether it be indigenous people, which is like the colonialism, the old colonialism that we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then this age of new imperialism, which focuses on Africa and Asia, oftentimes interactions fall into two different categories. They're either, oh, these people are so savage and primitive, we need to civilize them in some sense. Or as you're saying, which is like more benevolent, like these people have no agency. They're just poor victims in this. We need to just leave them alone. There's kind of like a noble, savage dimension to it as well.
Right. The way they need to be saved.
Yeah.
A white man.
Yeah, in the same way, like they're more objects being acted upon than agents that have their own unique cultures and norms and also faults, which Chinua Achebe depicts in the other novel, which is really interesting because going into it, reading it, I when I read Heart of Darkness, I'm obviously not, or I guess, you know, some people think racism is the spectrum, but I don't interpret me to be one. So when I read Heart of Darkness, I was absorbed by the political message and was very maddened by like what I saw as abuses of the colonial system, and I was like very critical of it, and I was very oh my God, those poor Africans mentality, like this colonial abuses that they had to read. That was just me as a high school senior. But then when I read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, he doesn't fall into kind of like both sidesism, where he says like, oh, there's some faults with this side and some faults with this side. But he shows the complexity and the nuances of a fictional culture, the Igbo people, which are, some people believe, are based on the Igbo people in Nigeria. He focuses the complexity on them, and he shows how there was outcasts within their society. There were dimensions of their society that one would say today, with our cultures and norms, would be wrong. They practice polygamy. The main character, Okonkwo, is there. He beats his wives, etc. The outcasts of society are the first to go to the missionaries, the European missionaries that arrive at their village. So he kind of shows the complexities and nuances of it, but also still shows how dehumanizing Europeans are at the same time. So he tells it from an African perspective. He wrestles with a lot of the complexities and nuances of African society. He shows it as being of a very particular African society, I should say. It's not appropriate to like generalize, right? He's very clear that this is a particular African society, and even the customs and norms of that village, he makes a point in this fictional world to say like they're viewed as outdated by another village, or maybe slightly tweaked by another village or clan. So I think he's more deliberate about that. He shows the complexities of that village life, and then Things Fall Apart of well before Europeans arrived, but European in colonialism and imperialism is equally dehumanizing and contributes to things falling apart, not just for the societies he describes, but also for the main character on Konkwo, and there's a very moving ending at the end. But yeah, that was a long-winded answer. But those were my introductions to these books, which are now actually on Project Gutenberg for free. So I'm going to provide links to them for whoever wants to read them beneath this.
Oh yeah, can you send me the link too?
For sure. I think you'll like this one. Like, just substitute it for... Let me stop recording. Oh, is Caitlin on? All right. We're done. Or any comments, Ms. Garcia? Anything you want to add, interests, different perspectives about colonialism in general? Or maybe stuff you read?
No, I think I said as much as I could without sounding dumb.
Oh, gee. Well, hopefully, I know Miss Torres said she gave me a shout out for
You're still
talking
recording.
about this book. So hopefully, she didn't join this call, but she said, or hopefully she'll be able to comment on it if I messed up one of the themes or I was talking about it in a very inappropriate way about Things Fall Apart, because I know the 10th graders are supposed to read Things Fall Apart. But yeah, all right, we're done.